So I think, if it's all right with you, Mark, we might start by asking you about Brecht. Ireland has a kind of a tradition of playwrights looking at and revisiting and doing versions of European classics, from Chekhov, Ibsen, Strindberg, and Russian playwrights whose names I can't pronounce.
Turgenev.
Turgenev, but not Brecht. So what is it about Brecht that attracts you?
I think I first read Brecht just looking through plays in the library at university. I sort of found Brecht for myself. And I think actually what I responded to, first of all, was a certain sort of poetic sensibility. It's a very tangible, materialistic, I guess, sort of poetry, but it is a theatre poetry, and a very wry, sly sort of peasant humour in Brecht's writing, and both those really appeal to me. And I think alongside the politics, but I think certainly when he was the first wave of big Brecht productions in the 60s and 70s, they were sort of read and produced through the prism of a sort of English sort of Fabian socialism, which was a little bit sort of vegan and a little bit sort of hair shirty, and actually and there's a pleasure and a love of the concrete in the material, and as I say, a humour which is very different from a sort of smart boulevard humour, but there's a sort of peasant humour about Brecht that I was really drawn to, and that I thought that British productions and translations, for my money, hadn't quite honoured those things in Brecht. So that's why I was keen to have a go at doing some English versions of Brecht.
Yeah, and so Life of Galileos is a play that you had seen, and why pick that play to revisit?
Yeah, I mean, the ambition of the play, that it's about a whole society with this incredible central character, this incredible part for an actor, was something that fascinated me. And actually, I did a couple of years before that, I did an English version of a Brecht play called The Mother. Not to be confused with Mother Courage, but he wrote a play called The Mother, which is from a Gorky novel, which is about the politicization of a working class mother, and in the end, she leads the Russian Revolution. So I made an English version of that a few years ago, and Brecht originally wrote that as a fantastic central part for his wife, Helena Weigel. But the rest of the cast was made up of a lot of amateur actors and a huge amateur chorus, and they played it in working class districts in, I was going to say Dublin, in Berlin. It was, the beginning of the rise of fascism, and then the left sort of reacting against that. And I made a version of that, and we did it in a totally free performance in a space called The Scoop on the South Bank. And sometimes we had 1,000 people a night. This is about 3 summers ago. Sometimes we had, if the weather was good, we had 1,000 people a night. Many of whom just turned up because they were just walking down the street and just heard it was on. And by the end of the evening, they were clapping along with the song called "In Praise of Communism." And I thought that was rather something. It was great that most people who came there hadn't been to the theatre before. They hadn't heard of Brecht. They didn't bring with them anxiety and baggage about, am I going to understand these supposed techniques and things that are supposed to... But also it made me realise that actually English people, although they frequently return these right-wing governments, if you scratch under the surface, they do have a great sense of sort of justice and fair play, and they root for an underdog. I think we were sort of more or less in a shopping mall, really. And I think if you did do that in a shopping mall in the American Midwest, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think you'd be sort of driven out of town. But actually, weirdly, these people who vote Tory governments in, they also have this sense of... So it actually sort of gave me an odd faith in the British people, that actually, that underneath the surface, there is a sort of... communality that still sits somewhere underneath that. So I did that, and then the RSC then asked me to do the Galileo, and it's just great as a writer just to engage with a really great writer and try and get inside their mind and their way of working, and rethink the rhythms of your own language. You're trying not to make them fit into your rhythms, but trying to find their rhythms, I think, is just apart from this, just a really good technical exercise to do, just to sort of work different parts of your muscle as a writer. I mean, unfortunately, the Brecht estate insists that it's billed as translated by, which is dishonest. Because I mean, I have spent quite a lot of time in Germany now. I can just about, sort of order a coffee and stuff. But there's no, and so I did have the German text there and a German dictionary, but yeah, I had a literal translation as well. And most other times you'd be allowed to bill that as in a version by, but for some reason they have this thing, you have to call it a translation by, so it feels a little bit, trades descriptions was a little bit dishonest.
Music is clearly a really important part of Brecht, and music has increasingly become an important part of your own original work as well. So could you talk a little bit more about what music means to you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like most people, I've always loved music. I mean, it is something you grow up with and it's part of your life. But after I'd graduated from university, I was doing bits and pieces of jobs in London. I applied for a front of house job at the English National Opera, just because just saw it in the paper, English National Opera. I thought that'd be quite a nice thing to do. So then I found myself every night tearing tickets, selling programs, and watched, because the repertoire keeps on changing, watching a lot of operas. They had really good programs, very expensive programs with lots of essays and stuff, but there'd always be somebody who'd leave one under their seat when they left at the end of the evening. So then I would take the program home on the tube, and so I read, the essays about the composers and all the biographies of the singers and blah, blah, blah. So I almost felt like I did a sort of 18-month
course
in opera. And then somebody that I met there then asked me to be assistant director on an opera, so then I realised I was going to have to face a cast, and I didn't read music, so then I just bought different recordings. It was a Verdi Il Trovatore, so I bought different recordings and I bought the score, and then taught myself not to read the music, but to look as though I was following the dots. So I just, it's when everybody's singing at the same time, there's like 8 vocal lines and they're singing fast, the pages go like that. But I would just be able to look as though it's so I sort of did all that, and then it's funny how you sort of do things and then sort of. So I sort of learnt some skills there, and then I bought CDs and sort of learnt the repertoire, and then then the playwriting took over. So it was only a few years ago that I thought, hang on, I spent all that time and really enjoyed it, connecting with opera. I ought to put those things together. So I was introduced to a Northern Irish composer called Conor Mitchell, and Conor and I wrote a little short opera, and we wrote this song cycle for Mark Almond. That's called The 10 Plagues. You mentioned that,
which he's recording at the moment.
Yeah, he's doing it as a album that's going to come out in June, and that's one of those strange things. When you're 15, listening to Tainted Love on the radio, you don't think flash forward 30 years, you make an album with Mark Almond. That's rather great. And then and as a result of that, then I got sort of met people in the opera world and composers and stuff, and so now I'm actually doing a writing libretto for what is still called a grand opera. That sounds quite good in Dublin, doesn't it? A grand opera for the Norwegian National Opera. So it's a main stage, 16 the chorus, 17 the orchestra.
Will it be in Norwegian?
No, they did. They phoned me and offered me the job, and I went, that was fantastic. I'd love to write that. And then I put the phone down, and you just think, that's a really stupid question to ask, but I'm going to have to ask. So I had to phone them back and say, now, it's not in Norwegian. You know I don't speak Norwegian. They said, of course you don't. I said, I know, but
Ravenhill,
I didn't want to get 6 months down the line and then I handed something in English and you go, what? We wanted Norwegian. But no, I mean, actually, as in most countries, they have much better English than the English. And it allows them to set up co-productions with other countries.
Something very primal about opera that seems to me to resonate with your work.
Every syllable, you don't quite know what the composer's going to do with it, but it could be that every single syllable is given great emphasis and given great weight, and so there's nothing that can be chucked away. Potentially every single vowel sound has got to earn its right to be there. So you cut and pare it down, and that's really satisfying, just to carve away until you've got the absolute nugget or whatever.
I mean, you would clearly be like that instinctively anyway. I mean, your plays are...
I'm not sure
languages. I mean, there's an excessiveness to the swearing, for example, or to the tone of the language, but very, very kind of concise.
Yes, I suppose so. But yeah, I always look back at them and think they're a bit overwritten. Now I've worked on the opera libretto, it's so squeezed. Yeah, the plays look a bit, uncut.
So you're becoming increasingly minimalist.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I know, but certainly there is, there's that sort of, I do enjoy the libretto writing, a play that was as condensed as that would sound, odd, which might be good. You might want some plays to sound odd, but I think that because it's, that word that would take a fraction of a second in a play might potentially take many seconds in an opera. So it's a different use of language, I think.
Yeah, an understanding of language as music, in fact.
Yeah. It's got to, but also there's got to be more gaps in the libretto in a way, because what's the score doing? It's not quite the subtext, but it's sort of space around the words, and it's doing other things, and the score can even be an argument with the words. So there's a lot of air around the words. There's something else going on that's the music, which in many ways, oftentimes is more important at some moments than the words, but so that they have a relationship with each other.
One of the things I love about your work is the way that it confronts. And it confronts a reality, or it is skeptical about the reality that the characters are kind of creating for themselves on stage. And one of the moments that really struck me in your version of The Life of Galileo is the moment where Galileo is at the court and he's trying to demonstrate the proof of his theories about the solar system. And he says to the court, he has his telescope set up, and he says to them, look through the telescope at the sky and you will see. And none of them will look through the telescope. And it's an interesting moment. I mean, I wonder how you approach that, because as it's a history play, we can all sit in the audience and say, of course the Earth is in a solar system as opposed to an Earth-centric system. We know, we've got the answers. I wonder if you think about that or think of parallels for that now, today. Are there realities we're not confronting? Are there telescopes that we're not looking through?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there are. But yeah, I mean, I think the challenge of producing that play, Galileo, is that, the dice can be too big, because we do have the benefit of hindsight. The dice can be too loaded, and the rest of the characters, a lot of the rest of the characters can sort of be played as sort of just idiots or clowns.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a fundamental, and I don't know whether necessarily in our production that we've done that any better, but it's just a fundamentally different idea of how the world works. Before Galileo's generation, the idea of testing things and getting empirical truth was just not considered to be the way to acquire knowledge. You acquired knowledge through argument and discussion, and it was a philosophy. And if you could prove your case through argument, then that was the person who won the case. So the idea that you might set up tests and get empirical proof seemed to be rather cheap, sort of shoddy, pragmatic, sort of almost ignoble thing to do. So those people are brought up in this whole system of debate, argument, philosophy, and that's what creates reality, not these little grubby thing pushing bits of metal around and seeing whether it moves to here, there, or whatever. And of course, so trying to honour the fact that those characters have got a worldview that was the dominant worldview, which we might now know or think is wrong, is the case of getting the balance in the play. So, yeah, and I guess as a playwright, one of the things you'd hope to try and do is to sort of historicise the present, that every human being can't quite conceive that our moment in history is just another historical moment with its own set of circumstances. Our moment always feels like the eternal moment or the true moment or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how often I've succeeded to do that, but I think to give us sense that this is a historical moment as much as any other moment, and that with hindsight we'll see that there are things that we thought were just givens that are just in 100 years' time will seem ludicrous. I think that's, to be able to move around our present.
Yeah.
And to be able to get some sense of historicity, that's probably a made-up word, about it. It's one thing that potentially you can do as a playwright.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So that suggests you have quite a lot of sympathy for the people who resist Galileo's truths.
I think, yeah, or just to see them not as buffoons.
Yeah.
That there was a dominant worldview, and most of us at any given time can only see within that dominant worldview. That's, we can't.
Yeah.
We live within, most of what we believe and most of what we know is passed on to us by other people, and so that's of necessity going to be a little bit dated because it's being passed down rather than discovered.
And very hard to resist as well.
And obviously yes, and also obviously within the play, there are power structures that are enforcing that dominant worldview, and there are economic and political interests that are being served by that dominant worldview.
Yeah, I mean, it's chilling when he recants. There's a bell that tolls to announce that Galileo has recanted.
Yeah, and Brecht, he loves at the right moment to use a good bit of melodrama. So in Mother Courage, you get Katerina on the roof drumming. So there's often just that couple of minutes in the play where he's using a trick that Boucicault or somebody might have used. There is always a little moment where he just goes, actually just a few minutes here of full-blooded melodrama, and the moment of waiting to find out whether Galileo recants ramps up the tension and pretty much the melodrama after an evening of all sorts of different rich things, but essentially a sort of dialectically driven play of argument and ideas, and then just hits you with melodrama when it's needed. And
I think what it creates is a real sense of ethical dilemma. That you understand why Galileo recants, you understand why he then writes a second book in secret and so on. But you see it as a real tension and kind of a humanity facing this ethical dilemma, and that runs through. I mean, that concern with ethical dilemmas and choosing which way to go is something again that runs through your work.
Yes, I mean, Brecht's much better at those. He's much better at most things than me, he's very good at choices and characters making and being confronted with choices, and he's able to see those. I mean, he thinks very much in a philosophical and dialectical way, so the plays are constructed on a series of choices. I think it's probably a bit more random in my own playwriting, but
it seems so much to the fore in Shopping and Fucking right from the beginning. What are Lulu and Rob going to do with Gary? What are the choices there? What are they going to take the jobs that Brian is offering them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I still. I mean, I do think there are ethical choices to be made in life and on the stage, and so I think a lot of the whole postmodern condition is sort of doing away with any sense of ethics and any sense of right and wrong, good and bad, and everything being relative. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that has interested me about plays is that we sort of exist in this sort of post-ethical sort of feel-good sort of haze, and that actually one of the things that drama can do is bring us to moments where actually something can clearly be right or wrong or good or good or bad. You get those things in maybe in sort of slightly more generic things, or in melodrama or soap opera or something, and then but to have a sort of complex, it can still be complex, but there can still be choices between right and wrong. I think that sort of interests me, and that just feels exciting. It feels like drama as well. Get in there like now that's good or bad. Yeah,
and then the conflict is, as an audience member, or perhaps also as a writer, is where do your sympathies? I mean, what choice would you make? And how do you judge the character for making that choice?
Yeah.
Do you judge your characters? Do you sympathise with them? Do you?
I don't know. I think I have quite an odd attitude to characters. Yeah, I was at this conference a few weeks ago, and different writers talking, and A.S. Byatt was saying, well, obviously it's so awful when a character has to die, or a character has to, because they're your best friend and you know them and you love them, and I thought, oh God, I really don't. And maybe she's a very empathic person, and maybe I'm a sort of psychopathic person, but I do sort of invest in the writing of those characters, and I do have sort of strong feelings when I'm writing, but I don't feel about them the same way as I would if a friend was in pain. I mean, yeah. I think I do have a certain distance on them. I think to a certain extent there is quite a significant part of me that's standing back and sort of observing them, and yeah, I think to a certain extent, sort of doctor-patient, as much as
you're the doctor.
Because maybe that's just how I justified it to myself. Well, I thought you wouldn't be a very good doctor if every time the patient came in and said they weren't feeling very well, or even if you had to break the news and they had a terminal illness, that you were in sobbing, fits of tears, and then you had to go and tell the partner that they died, and you couldn't get the words out because you were crying so much. So I thought, so maybe that would make you a less worse doctor. So I sort of thought, okay, well maybe A.S. Byatt can spend several days weeping if a character dies, but maybe there's also another way of thinking. Okay, well if I was a doctor, I wouldn't do my job so well if I cried all the time. But or maybe that's just me justifying the fact that she's an empath and I'm a psychopath. I don't know.
I like this idea of the playwright as a doctor. Maybe it's a novelist issue that Byatt is
it's a
so
novelist
close
issue.
To.
It's an A.S. Byatt issue. She's got issues.
Good, if we learn nothing else. That's what we learned tonight. One of the ethical dilemmas facing Galileo is the tension between research and the art of his science and money. That he wants to do nothing but research, but he also has to pay the milkman. And in order to do that, he has to take on students and teach students who clearly have no interest in their horizons.
I know, that's great, because that's in the first couple of scenes, and that does just seem, it's great when you read a play that's written in the first draft in the late 30s, and there's the first couple of scenes got loads of jokes about trying to teach, but the university saying, well, if you teach those courses, they'll sell better, and university teaching is a commercial enterprise, and blah blah blah. And you think, God, somebody could have written all those jokes. And it's great they come near the beginning of the play, because it's something that sort of relaxes our audience into, relaxes, hopefully angers our audience a bit as well. But he's found that he thinks he's gone into teaching, and he discovers he's part of a commercial enterprise. Yeah. And anybody who, certainly in England, my friends who are in university teaching, that's what they talk about a lot.
Absolutely. We got told recently by the president of UCD that courses with 8 students or fewer are niche. And we can't justify economically paying them or teaching them anymore, paying us to teach them. It seems to strike a chord, because if in Galileo's life it's science, but there's something very artistic and creative about the kind of science that he's doing. And it seems to strike a chord now with us today, outside, beyond university teaching, and thinking about the relationship between art and economic value, and constantly being told that art, in fact, should be valued for its economic output, as opposed to its artistic. And I know that you've talked about this before, and I wonder, how you see that relationship between the artist and the funder, and what the artist is being expected to do for funding.
There is no utopian solution to that problem. They're always going to sit really oddly beside each other and fight each other, So one of the reasons, one of the ways that we've been, certainly in the English debate, justifying arts funding is that it is in itself a sort of economic stimulus. That if you just give this theatre £3 million, and even the price of VAT on the tickets alone pays for a lot of that, and then it generates, cafes and pubs and and that it leads to a whole urban regeneration around it. So we're sort of saying, well, if capitalism ever gets a bit sluggish at points, then just put a bit more money into the arts, and it'll help turbocharge capitalism back to where it was, which doesn't seem a very, inspiring and noble thing to do, to be part of a rescue package for capitalism. But that's obviously the thing that's most persuasive to governments of the last 20 years. Alongside that, and that worked slightly better with the new Labour government, was to say, well, we will do that, plus we'll send groups out into do education work and work with refugees and work with and sometimes people actually say, well, I know the work in the main house is rather elitist, but have you seen all the fantastic work that we're doing with schools and and community groups and everything? And that seems a bit odd as well, to just sort of say, well, the work on the main house isn't really what we're about. We're about the stuff that goes on around outside it, in which case, why do the work in the main house? So both of those arguments, but governments like to hear those. So, managements of theatres and arts institutions have used that. And, it is the hardest thing of all to say art is art, and art works well as art. And that, I think it does have a great function of genuinely being part of a genuine democracy, of people testing out the world and testing out the possibilities of the world and the possibilities of working together and how we think individually and collectively. But that's a hard sell to go into. I can see that's a hard sell to go into any government department. But it just depends as to how much the work is compromised by having to frame it as this economic stimulus. Has essentially been the main argument that we're really good for capitalism.
Do you see it being compromised? Do you think that...
It certainly doesn't fire you to get up in the morning and think, oh, great, well, if I can just get a play on here, in 10 years' time, there'll be extra branches of sock shop and paper chase and five more Starbucks will be in this area, where before there was just empty warehouses. It's not the thing to really get you going. I think the major thing that has been fundamentally compromised is our relationship with sponsors and the. I think the artist being funded by the state is always going to be complex, but I think there's a way through to negotiate that. But I think English theatre has been fundamentally compromised by its relationship with the corporate sector, because in the decades leading up to a massive financial crisis, the theatres have become very, very close to, apart from things, the banks themselves. Whole seasons are sponsored by banks and the financial sector. Artistic directors often have to spend 3 evenings a week taking people from the financial sector out for supper to talk to them, to persuade them to give money to the theatre. Seats are reserved at opening nights. Sometimes people who don't turn up or who don't even know what production they're seeing from the financial sector. So again, sort of historicising the present. That in 50 years' time, that's going to look very, very weird. That as we were, with hindsight, as we were heading towards this financial crisis, people who only 20 years before had seen themselves as very radical, and probably actually carried on seeing themselves as very radical, were spending days of their time in any given week getting closer and closer to the very financial sector that was going to lead to huge depression, that was going to lead to austerity, that was going to lead to cutting of funding for the arts. So you've sort of, you have essentially been wining and dining and giving huge billing to your own assassin. So that's...
Do we need to become the assassins then? Does art need to? Does theatre need to start leading the revolution?
I think it's a tall ask to ask artists alone to do something. My colleagues at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the literary department were, who I love and had a great time with. But they would say, "Why aren't the playwrights more political?" And I said, "Well, I don't see anybody here going out and organising a demonstration or picketing something or doing anything. So you can't all sit here in your office as literary managers and artistic directors and stuff and say, why aren't the playwrights political? Playwrights can only, exist within the culture. So I don't think we can ask of a playwright that somehow they would make a political act if the literary manager and the artistic director and the actors wouldn't do that. But I think it is a curious moment when something is sort of active. I think it was probably a temporary moment when something as active as the Occupy movement happened, and that you realise that everybody in theatre is totally separate from that movement. There is no connection. I'm talking about the experience in London and in England, but the whole theatre culture is totally separate and has got no connection with anything to do with the Occupy movement. Whereas, obviously, one of the very first things that everybody seemed to do when they set up some sort of group in '68 was, let's have the street theatre committee. It just seemed to be the first thing that women's groups did and gay groups did and civil rights, black movement groups did in London. We need our street theatre. So, for good or ill, I think there's something very different about what happened in '68 and theatre's role in protest and where theatre sat alongside the Occupy movement. Yeah. Theatre was essentially inside big steel and glass buildings that said, in big letters, sponsored by Accenture or TSB or whatever, while the Occupy movement was happening.
Outside.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about you 20 years ago, and you have a play.
I was thin. Didn't have very much hair. I lost the hair really early.
But you were writing this brilliant play. And if you were giving advice to yourself, given the kind of the context that you're talking about and the funding crisis and the situation, if you were talking to yourself, right, or to a young playwright, says, I have a play. What do I do with this play? What advice would you give?
You have to be quite canny about having the space and the time to write the play that you want to write, and that can be, I did quite. It gets harder and harder as every decade goes by because it gets so much more expensive to live. I was looking at the house prices in Dublin this morning in the paper. They were fun. They were £2 million to live anywhere in Dublin, it looked like.
And that's after the crash.
But, I can see every year that just the things that are thought of that just make you into a sane human being just get more expensive. So even when I first arrived in London, you could still sort of do a sort of Morrissey, sort of Oxfam shop chic and sort of get away with it. And obviously we didn't have, and I love all these things, but obviously we didn't have the expense of running our smartphones and our laptops and all of those sort of things. You could still live a bit cheaper. Not as cheap as you could when you could sort of squat things in the 80s and stuff. But then I look at kids today and the kids today, but they literally would be thought of as mad if they didn't have really good trainers, really good clothes, really good smartphone. They would just be thought of as a freak and abnormal. So it's very hard to resist that, and so it becomes more, which is the attractiveness thing about capitalism, is that you actually go, even just to function as a human being, I'm going to have to earn £25,000-30,000 a year not to be treated as almost mad that I don't have these things. So you have to, in some way, before you can give up some stuff and accept that you're going to have to live in a way that people might conceive as nutty because of its poverty for a few years at least, before hopefully then you get produced and you start to make a living from it. But I can see that that's, with every year that gets harder and harder to do. Just the basic cost of being a human being means that young young people coming out of drama school and whatever, and with debt, with debt
Yeah.
that we didn't have, instantly have to go into doing very long shifts on very long jobs. So there's less and less space to write. And then when there is the space to write, you're very anxious that it starts earning you money straight away. So you want to write something that a theatre's definitely going to produce or a TV company's definitely going to pick up on. So you start to look for what's the formula that will mean that you will get instant reward.
Which is where patronage is meant to step in, so that you can create work that is kind of boundary pushing, or that is starting out as a germ of an idea and then that you can develop, as opposed to something that is instantly, as you say, commercially successful.
Yeah, and I mean, there was it more or less was finishing by the time even I graduated, but there was, certain sort of tacit acceptance that unemployment benefit and housing benefit and stuff was patronage. Which there is a lot of, good English work that was produced during 60s, 70s, 80s because of housing benefit and unemployment benefit. If you were prepared to, it was never the life that the Daily Mail, it was never gold water taps, but you could live if you were prepared to live at a pretty bare subsistence level, you could actually have several years of benefits to get your theatre company started or to write your novel. Sort of, not very
unwitting patron.
But sort of accepted. Okay, well, if young people are given a few years to sign on, then bands will come out of that, and novels will come out of that, and films will come out of that.
You're doing this masterclass tomorrow, and I think the theme for the day is, let me see, I wrote this down: truth, integrity, and risk.
Yeah, I was asked to do truth, integrity, and risk. I would just start with some simple writing exercises and see where that takes us. I'll try and push them towards truth, integrity, and risk, but I mean, I'm very willing to be led with them. So if they want to do lies and safety, I'll resist. But maybe we'll end up with lies and safety. I mean, I just want to do some practical theatre making, playwriting exercises, and be. I mean, whenever I've done those things, I haven't got a sort of manner. I mean, I think personally for myself, I set myself specific aims. But if I do a sort of teaching thing, it's really to allow that group of people to explore what they want to explore with me, setting some sort of structure. So, yeah, I'm not a sort of manifesto wielder in that way.
So if they want to keep it all to themselves, hidden and within, that's okay with you?
Well, it'd be nice if they wrote something down. Yeah.
Do you think of yourself as a storyteller? I
have a sort of contradictory attitude to that. I mean, in some ways, that's sort of that's enforced upon us more and more by the sort of story rules of Hollywood. And everything has to be constructed along the same sort of narrative rules, from a news story to everything has to follow sort of a certain rule of story. So in some way, I think story is used as a way of sort of lessening our experience. So I think I'm sort of fascinated by how much is there actually a basic human need for story, and how much is that sort of imposed. So I think quite a lot of my plays are sort of obsessed by story, but sort of have a bit of an argument with story, or still trying to work out how much of that is at all a sort of essential human need, or how much of that is sort of imposed as a cultural, political thing.
So you don't necessarily see storytelling as the automatic cure for the trauma?
No, I think there's quite a lot of slightly generalised sort of misty-eyed, well, we're just storytelling creatures and we just exist through story, and the only way is story. I think that's a bit romanticised and a bit generalised. We certainly do keep on returning to stories, and you can see that the narrative of a play is something that an audience engages with very immediately. But just because we engage with it immediately doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. So I was thinking sort of, yeah. I think I have a sort of, I'm a Gemini. I have a dualistic relationship with story.
That sounds good. One of the things that stories do is they weave things together, and they connect disparate parts and moments together. And that's something that seems to resonate with your work, that it can be both fragmentary and about weaving things together with a kind of a narrative or theme that is kind of running through. It's something, I think, that fragmentation, that social fragmentation, critics tend to write about your work and focus on, but what is also there is also connection. and that need for that human instinct that you were talking about, that need for human connection and the kind of yearning for each other and the recognition that we need to live together.
Yeah. What can I add to that? That was very brilliantly put. I agree with all of the above.
Discuss. No. Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering, in terms of, do you see that? Is that something that your plays are about? How we live together?
Yes. No, I was just thinking that some drama students were given this project. They had to go for 6 weeks or something, and they're locked in a room. It was like cheap teaching because there was no teacher there. Just sent them away.
That's the future.
And after 6 weeks, they'd been working on one of my plays. They said that's what they came up with. They'd been sent to find out what the play was about, and they said, "Oh, it's how human beings interact with each other." And I thought, well, I think that could have been pretty much any play. So, yeah, no, I think again, yeah, I think the idea that no connections are possible, that everything is fragmented, and that nothing is connected, has been quite a sort of fashionable thought, and that there are no grand narratives, and I'm sure there's huge truth in that, but I think there is also still a sort of social ethical necessity to see whether there are any connections left and whether we can make any connections. And even if we fail to make connections, to make grand narratives and make everything add up, that still searching for that is necessary, even if it fails. I think it's just too easy just to go, nothing's connected, everything's fragmented, everybody's isolated, nothing makes sense, history was just, wasn't linear, blah, blah, blah. I think it's just too easy to sit back and rather bleak, just to sit back and go, it's all just a mess, nothing connects, give up. I think we just have to keep on trying, even if we're very suspicious of the fact that you can't explain everything through one big grand narrative. I think you have to give it a go. Saw theatre. I started making theatre in my bedroom, either making it with my brother or little dolls or puppets, and making scenery. And we did our 2-person version of The Sound of Music when I was about 4 years old. My brother had to play all the other parts. I was Maria. So that's a lot of children's play plus a count and a baroness and everything. But I just always made up plays, and then and I just carried on doing that. So I only wrote because I wanted to have something to act in or direct or to be part of. So I haven't. The words only exist for me as part of the process. So I think of myself much more of a theatre maker than a writer. I mean, it seems like the bit of theatre that people like me to do the best is to write the words. I mean, if I had a choice, I would be more rewarded for being a director or a leading actor or something. But I seem to do best. People seem to like it when I write the words. So that's the bit that I sort of do the most. But I don't write anything else. I've got no notebook. I've got no diaries. I've got no letters. The only words that I really do are the plays, and then I got involved in the dirty business of journalism as well, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed seeing how words could fit into columns and articles and stuff like that. But those are the only 2 things that I've ever done with the written word.
But writing libretti is probably a little bit like poetry, is it, or no?
It's dramatic poetry. I mean, it exists as But yeah, absolutely. But it's definitely dramatic poetry. It's moving forward. It's dynamic. It's shared between people. It doesn't have the same ability to really. Well, sometimes music can, but it doesn't have the same ability. Hasn't got the same reflective quality as a lot of good poetry.
Tom?
Just to follow on a little bit more from that, can you talk a little bit about your experience as a director, which you've been doing, I guess, a bit more lately with your own work and other people's work? Has that always been the plan to be directing more? And just could you talk a little bit more about that part of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, I'd like to do more of it, but I haven't really done enough of it to get very good at it. You know, it's a real skill to direct and a real art. And like anything, I just think you need to do a lot of it. So I only really get a chance to do it every now and then. So in an ideal world, I'd just love to have my own theatre. Could be anywhere. I don't need to be in. Ideally, I'd have 8 actors and a building, and be in the middle of nowhere, and we just put on plays, and I could direct them and write them and everything. But and that would be. And then I could direct and learn how to direct. So I'm very aware that every time I direct, I don't have enough experience of it to do it particularly well. Whereas, because with directing you need the resources, you need people, you need money, you need time to learn how to do it. Whereas with writing, I was able to just sit and write and write and write and rewrite and write and write until I could get reasonably good at it. And obviously, you can't just sit at your kitchen table and direct. I've tried, but you need the gatekeepers to give you the resources, and I was never very good at getting that, which is partly why I wrote. I did bash on doors for quite a long time trying to get to direct more, and I didn't get that far. And I'm not that. I make no great claims for my directing. I would like to be a better director, but I think it's good from time to time to do some, because I think it makes you a better writer. It reminds you what it is, and so I like that contact with actors and the rehearsal room. And if somebody said now for 3 years you can just direct back to back to back, work for 3, I'd do it, because it would give me the chance to actually hopefully get good at it. But I'm very definitely rookie director still.
Can I ask you? Can you talk a little bit about working on Shakespeare with the Worcester Group? Because that's obviously like quite a left field thing to have done as part of your work.
Yeah, it was like a once in a lifetime experience, and it was intense and great and fantastic. I'm really glad I did it. Yeah, it was this production of Troilus and Cressida that had been set up by the RSC in a co-production with the Worcester Group, the New York-based performance art, sort of essentially, I guess, theatre group, the Worcester Group. So the idea was that Rupert Gould, esteemed English director, floppy hair, would his way into the rehearsal room and direct the English actors as the Greeks, and that Liz in New York would direct the American actors in the Trojans, and then they would bring them together as part of the Cultural Olympiad. Rupert wrote a film script which somebody amazing was producing it, like I think it was Justin Timberlake. So then he got a phone call like a few weeks before rehearsals from Justin Timberlake saying, "We've moved the dates. Your movie is going to shoot at the time when Rupert was supposed to be rehearsing the Troilus and Cressida." So I was literally the only person in the RSC who was available. Not even the box office staff were available because I was just writing, so you can just stop and start any time to direct the Greek bit. So after just a few weeks, I found myself in a room with the English actors working on Troilus and Cressida. So it was great. I mean, it's a strange, fascinating, dark, difficult, complex play. So we explored it as best we could, and then we literally cut and pasted our scenes backwards and forwards between us doing, I hope, sort of intelligent, text-based, I think, quite good, rigorous, embodied, quite physical, sort of British acting, and then they had their microphones and their video screens and performance art, and so it was a sort of weird sort of cut and paste sort of thing that didn't quite work, but it was a really great thing to do, and I was able to go and watch their rehearsals as well. So to be part of 2 completely different rehearsal processes that were happening at the same time was it was 8 weeks of sort of madness, but really, yeah, but great. It's one of those things you think, that is a once in a lifetime experience, and it was. I don't know, it was great. It was a bit like fighting the Trojan War, but it was good. It was good.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
I'm here with a lot of people from my college. We're training as actors, and in our training, we've learned to make theatre through devising. Moving forward now, there's a few people who are interested in moving into writing, and I'm just wondering, when you decide that you care enough about something that you want to write about it, how do you begin? Like, do you just sit down with a cup of tea, or is it a thing that you, I don't know, have a paper and pen and do you just begin, or what is that process like?
Yeah, I think it has been slightly different for every play. I mean, some plays I've had just an image or just a phrase, or sometimes a situation. Yeah, the starting point's always been slightly different, but on the whole, I've written the first draft as quickly as I can, just to sort of get material, just to sort of get stuff out. I mean, often I've been thinking about it not sort of intellectually thinking, but I've sort of had that image sitting in my head maybe often for years. I mean, I think nearly everything I've written is, if you trace the germ of it, it goes back years, and it's just sort of been sitting there, and then at some point it comes to either of its own necessity comes to the front of your brain, or you've promised somebody a play, and so it has to come to the front of your brain. But then I tend to write the first draft. I sort of think of the first draft as improvising on the page, anyway, and then you've got the raw material. And quite a lot of my plays, the final play has been almost completely different from the first draft. But the first draft is just sort of clay to make into something. So over a few days or a couple of weeks, just write, more or less non-stop. So you can take away your own sort of personal policeman in your head sort of thing, just to write whatever comes out, and then take that and start to shape it and edit it. And yeah, that's... So I think devising and improvising and stuff is... If you can start to then just develop the muscles then just to sort of work exactly as you would when you're improvising and devising, but sort of writing it down pretty much as fast as you can as you improvise it in your head. I think that's quite a good way to start writing a play.
Thank you.
Right down the front. Here it comes.
Yeah.
Hello. Kind of following on from that, do you say, I have something that I have to say, so I have to put it into a play, like an idea that something you need to say, or are you just like writing for a story kind of a thing?
I think if I really, really clearly know what I have to say, then I should just put it on a postcard and send it to somebody. So, and there are moments in my plays which I later want to go back and cut where people literally say what I think, but I don't think that's great playwriting, is to literally have people say what the playwright thinks, because it seems a waste of a whole play. Literally, if you know what you've got to say, then you could write an essay, or you could, if it's really straightforward, you could do the postcard thing. So it tends to be more things that I don't quite know the answer. I think when I write best, it's when I don't quite know the answer to, or I really can genuinely see 2 sides or 20 sides to something, or just something that's sort of worrying away at me. That's an insoluble thing, and then that seems like good fuel for a play, and theatre seems like quite a good way of putting those things, bringing those things alive as things that genuinely you're never going to quite be able to resolve, or you don't. Or maybe the play takes you a step forward to understanding, you personally and hopefully the audience, but that there isn't a solution to. I think that's when plays are the best, and sometimes sometimes that feels not enough, but I always regret it when I sort of try and put a message in or make people say literally something. It always seems to be a bit banal somehow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There.
Hi. Maybe a slightly more political sort of slant on these questions. You mentioned you're on ease with postmodernism, and I just wonder, would you make relationship between it and advanced corporate capitalism, that there's a fair amount of correspondence between aspects. Obviously, things are complex, and there's many different ways of looking at it. And maybe the second question, you also mentioned about the difficulties and problematic relationship of sponsorship from the corporate sector, and didn't really focus so much on the state sector or state-type funding. And I don't know so much in England, but in Ireland, as we see recently, and in all sorts of ways, the sort of culture that pervades really the top echelons of society and sort of drifts its way down, that it happens really in the arts as well. And how best as an individual or as a group, as a body, to both become aware and really to, I suppose, as you mentioned, like arts maybe fundamentally is who are we, what we're here, what's it all about, all sorts of those difficult, tough questions at times.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think none of the potential scenarios are ideal, but obviously the artist completely reliant on the box office is a difficult one, and unsustainable, often unsustainable to create a whole body of work. I mean, think of the brilliant explosion of the early careers of Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams, when they've got that really great relationship with the Broadway public, and you do genuinely feel as though there's a intelligent, popular theatre there, but it only lasts for a few years, and then somehow that public and creating a genuine sort of popular American intelligent art form, it's a very short window, and then essentially Miller, in later years, it's his relationship with theatres, subsidised theatre outside of America, that keeps him writing. And I mean, I think he kept on writing fantastic plays. I mean, they're less sort of big and in some ways melodramatic than the early plays, but I think plenty of the later plays are really, really great plays. But it couldn't sustain that relationship with the audience solely through the box office. So I don't think the artist free of state subsidy or corporate subsidy or any of that is really a possibility. So I think the least worst is the relationship with the state, because in a healthy state, it's part of a democracy. So everybody's got a debate about how that money is spent and where that money is spent, and it creates a vigorous debate around art and how the money is spent. So there's always a danger that you get levels of sort of bureaucracy and administration connected to state money, and there's a danger that the artist there's a pressure to write sort of socially worthy art just to justify the money. It's got to be sort of have an element almost of social engineering about the work, but I think those can be negotiated because it's part of a democratic process, much more than through the relationship with the corporate sector or the straightforward living by the box office method, which obviously would make a few writers for a short while very rich, while the rest of the writers would have to be waiters, or actors, and we'd all have to be waiters.
Yeah, Willie, do we have a mic? Willie.
Thank you. Mark, you've spoken about history, about social history, political, theatrical. I'm thinking also of cultural history projects like your work with Betty Bourne. If you think about a young playwright or anybody starting to write with that impatience to be contemporary and to write something contemporary, how useful is it to actually address what has gone before, and just, as part of as a writer's formation, or should you just ignore it, rip up the rule book, and do whatever you want?
No, I think on the whole, the compulsion and the necessity is to write about the present, and that's great and good. And I think it's one of probably the best things that a play can do, is to try and capture the experience of what it is to be you or us now. So I think that is one. I think that probably is the main, a good, healthy main focus of the theatre. I've slightly put history in relationship with history in some of the plays, because I think there is something that happened with neoliberal capitalism, is it does seem to cut off any sort of contact with the past. I mean, you do get sort of history channels and stuff. You get a sort of popular history, but a sense of a genuine connection with the national and a people's history seems to not quite suit that speed, and so if you don't have that sense of history, I think it is easy to lose your way and not to be able to find your way to eternally live in the present, sort of in a loop. I think is can be disempowering or something. And I did notice that really strongly with Irish friends of mine, that the generation older than me seemed to really talk about the past and history a lot. Sometimes maybe too much, I think, shut up. But they had a real sense of both family history, personal history, but also Irish history, like literally talk in great detail about, much more than English people could, about things that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and a sort of sharing of knowledge of Irish history seemed to be really, really strong. And then people younger than me, they really don't want to talk about it at all, or really don't want to know about it. People sort of go, that people younger than me seem to want to go, well, Ireland started at around about 1990, and nothing else. It didn't really exist before that. And please don't mention anything that happened before that. So it seemed to be very extreme. I mean, I think that's happened all over the world with neoliberal economies, that the relationship to the past and history has changed. But from my, limited experience, it seems really more marked in Ireland than anywhere else that I've come across. One generation possibly over-obsessed by history, the next generation in complete denial about history, would be my crude observation of your fair country.
No one is shouting to contradict you.
Come on, shut me down. Mm. Yes, and that was, it was a declared philosophy, wasn't it? The end of history. The philosopher Francis Fukuyama, who at the time, he's slightly recanted now, but at the time he was the real cheerleader for the Bush-Reagan form of neoliberal economics, and he said it's ended history because now all the problems have been solved. Everybody's getting wealthier, everybody's getting happier, everybody's getting healthier. So history has ended. It is the end of history. And then, as you say, sort of history came back again a few years ago with a bump.
Microphone for Willie.
I suppose you've spoken about what happens on stage as well, but something that I like to believe is that a play, at least temporarily, constitutes a community, however expensive it is and heavy on human resources it takes to make it happen. Do you think theatre has a function nowadays in that regard to constitute a community of people who, for that span of time, will look at a problem as presented by a playwright?
Yeah, I mean, I find the act of making theatre, that people make theatre, is so optimistic. I think however bleak the play, I just look and go, well, this is, in a way, I think that's why I feel a play can, the actual content or arc of the play can be incredibly bleak, but the act of putting it on is so incredibly optimistic. I mean, we had a day when we were rehearsing Candide at the RSC, when our director was in London because her play was transferring to the West End, so we didn't have the director, and so the actors would just sort of, they didn't talk about it beforehand, but they came in and we were just working on a scene. And by that time, because they'd been together for a whole season, they'd spent 6 or 9 months together, whatever it was, they just conducted the whole day, and it's a big, it's 22 in the cast or something, and musicians and everything. There was nobody leading. I mean, it sounds like, sort of very idealistic, but nobody meant it to be idealistic. I mean, because you quite often get that in theatre, everybody goes, well, it's going to be very organic, and then they all fight. But this was genuinely just, they'd been together long enough for an ensemble that they just started working through this. Oh, if you're there, then I can do that, and right, and I'm going to. And for 22 people for a whole day, just to be constantly doing little negotiations, little ways of working together. In our world, which is so self-centered and so often, about always asserting yourself and asserting your power and asserting your needs, that this large group of people could just for a whole day easily work around each other, negotiate, make something together. I just thought, God, this is the most optimistic thing I've ever seen, and I think theatre is amazing like that. It does prove that, despite all this sort of cruelty of our society and the pressure to be assert, find out who I am, not find out who anybody else is, that actually give actors 6 months together, and they can create a whole new way of being together that's cooperative and sharing and creative, and that was, and without sitting down and going, we're being sharing, creative and cooperative, they just naturally were doing it. I just thought, wow, I feel so, this is great. And that was at the Royal Shakespeare Company, which is very institutional. So, I think actors are pretty amazing.
That sounds like a bit of a utopia. How
Yeah.
do you feel as a writer then, actors are pretty amazing. How do you feel in terms of control over the final product? They take your work and then take it in directions that you didn't foresee or you might not even agree with, or, what's that relationship like for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I write theatre. I like giving it over. Mm-hmm. So I like that. I mean, the first production you're normally very closely involved with and attend rehearsals, and so you have a big input. But actually then it's really nice after that when the play goes out into the world and people do completely different productions that you're not involved with at all, and they reinvent it and make it theirs. I think that's one of the things, that I really like about theatre, is that it stops being yours after the first production, and then people ask me questions about the plays I can't remember why or how or when. I said, well, you're rehearsing it. I wrote it 15 years ago. You're 3 weeks into the rehearsal. You know all the, you've got far more of the answers than I have, and it won't help me at all to try and dredge up from 15 years ago why I think at that moment something happens. What's much more important is in this moment your decision about why he or she is doing that in the scene, not what somebody who is a complete. My whole cells of my body have renewed themselves many times since then. I have no connection with, you have much more of a connection with that play than I do.
Which is kind of a bodily metaphor for thinking about a connection with a play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see why she's a top academic.
I know, because I was, in preparing for today, because I'm a top researcher, I was somewhat stalking you, and I saw that you were involved in a Beckett seminar at the Royal Court earlier this year.
Yes. Yeah, no, it was good.
So he's someone who didn't give his authorial control away very easily.
No, he didn't, but it must be quite hard to assert it, isn't it? Yeah, they were great. It was just like 4 sort of classes. It was nice actually, because quite often, the English theatre is so anti-academic that even though most people who arrive have done quite high-powered degrees and actually can think intellectually, the message when you arrive, particularly in new writing theatres, is any idea or any intellectual idea or any discussion of anything that's at all philosophical or is taboo, and that you must just write about very simple, authentic, lived experience, and that essentially a writer is a sort of idiot, savant, or not even the savant bit's sort of missing, that you're a sort of holy fool, really, who sort of splurges out this stuff. So actually what was really nice, and Vicky's taken over at the course and they were putting on the Becketts, was, and I've completely forgotten the woman's name, anyway, she's a Beckett academic. So the playwrights were invited, and we had full-on sort of, post-structuralist sort of lectures about Beckett, and the playwrights were a bit sort of like, you don't do that to playwrights. But then actually everybody really got into it, and because actually, most people that actually studied that stuff at university but just they're told to forget that when they start working in the theatre, which always seems a bit odd. So actually we had, there was like proper classes, lectures on Beckett.
Right, so that sounds like quite a fruitful conjunction of academia and creative.
Yeah, and I think we should do more of that. I mean, there is this very anti-intellectual culture, well, in England in general, but in the theatre, that to be clever is to be punished in the theatre, which just seems a bit. I don't know why it just seems a bit odd.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see that suspicion all the time.
But then you get the opposite extreme as well. So the theatre and the academia have moved so far apart that then you do get some very sterile pieces of theorising about performativity and stuff in academia. That's gone more and more down that route. I mean, even when I was at university, there was a closer connection between what was being studied in the academy and what was being made in the theatre. And the theatre's become more and more sort of pragmatic as the academy has become more and more sort of theoretical and more sort of performance studies based rather than sort of theatre studies based. So they have sort of drifted apart in a big way, and I think they've got things to learn from each other. And so I think more of a dialogue between those could potentially be really, really good for both of them.
I think that sounds like a really, really good thing. It's a deal.
You're on.
It's a deal. Unless there are any other questions, burningly, I think this was a fab way to spend World Theatre Day.
Happy World Theatre Day.
Happy World Theatre Day, everybody. And thank you to Mark for giving us so much time. Thank you.